It was the summer of 1916, and New York had a way of holding heat like a grudge. The kind that sticks to your shirt, your skin, your thoughts. I was 16, maybe 17, the kind of age where you think you're too smart to get caught and too tough to care if you do. The Lower East Side was my kingdom, even if the crown was made out of second-hand caps and the palace smelled like boiled cabbage. I knew every corner, every face, every set of eyes that lingered too long when you walked past. But that night, the eyes watching me weren't from the neighborhood. They were from the law. Now, you gotta understand, cops back then weren't saints. Most of them would shake you down for a couple bucks, maybe smack you around a little, then send you on your way. But these two weren't the usual beat cops. They had that stiff, starched look like they'd been practicing how to look important in a mirror. One of them had a jaw you could have built a brick wall on. The other had eyes so cold they made the summer air feel like January. I knew right away they weren't here to talk about the weather. They didn't waste time. One of them said my name, my real one, Salvatore, in a voice that made it sound like an accusation. "Come with us," he said, like it wasn't even up for debate. They didn't explain, didn't ask. Just took me by the arm and walked me toward the curb, where a Model T was waiting. Back then, I didn't know you should never walk into a car with a cop unless you had to. I learned quick. The ride was short but loud. The streets were still alive with pushcarts and shouting in half a dozen languages: Italian, Yiddish, Polish, some Irish brogue here and there. My neighborhood wasn't just a place, it was a heartbeat. But every turn the car took pulled me farther away from it. We ended up at the precinct house, a squat brick building that smelled like ink and stale coffee. They booked me like they'd done it 1,000 times before: name, address, occupation. I told them, businessman. They laughed. I smiled. That was the first time I realized a smile could be a weapon. The charge? Petty theft. Something about a shipment gone missing from the docks. I didn't steal it, not personally, anyway, but I knew the guys who did. That's the thing about New York, you can be guilty without being guilty, if you know what I mean. And the cops? They didn't always care about the truth. They cared about making it look like they were doing something. The cell they put me in was a steel box with a bench that could break your back if you sat too long. Across from me was a drunk, red-faced, singing some Irish ballad about a girl named Molly. Next to him, a skinny kid my age, shaking like he'd swallowed ice. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and listened to the hum of the city outside. You'd be surprised how quiet it can sound from behind bars. Like the world keeps moving, but you're stuck in place. That night, I thought about my father. He came over from Sicily, worked hard, broke his back so I wouldn't have to. But I wasn't built for 10-hour shifts in a garment factory or pushing a cart through the streets. I was built for something else, I just didn't know what yet. Getting arrested didn't scare me. It just made me curious about the game, about the rules, about how a guy could get caught and still win. By morning, the cell door creaked open. A desk sergeant told me I was free to go. No explanation, no trial, not even a warning. Somebody had made a call, I could guess who. Maybe it was one of the older guys from the neighborhood who saw something in me. Maybe they figured I was worth more on the street than in a cell. Either way, I walked out into the sunlight like it was mine. And here's the thing, that first arrest taught me more than any school ever could. I learned that most cases fall apart before they even get started. I learned that the system isn't about justice, it's about leverage. And I learned that if you kept your mouth shut, smiled at the right time, and didn't let fear show, you could walk away clean. As I made my way back to the Lower East Side, I passed the same pushcarts, the same shouting, the same smells of fresh bread and fried onions. But something had shifted. Not out there, in me. I knew I'd be seeing those precinct walls again. Maybe a dozen times, maybe more. But now I wasn't just some street kid trying to keep out of trouble. I was starting to understand how to use trouble. And once you learn that, well, you stop playing to stay out of jail. You start playing to make sure that if you ever end up there again, it's on your terms. That was arrest number 1. And between you and me? It wouldn't be the last. Prohibition was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I don't just mean the money, though the money was sweet. I mean the doors it opened, the way it changed the whole city overnight. One day a guy's selling beer on a corner for a nickel. The next day it's illegal, and suddenly that nickel's worth $1 if you know the right people. I knew the right people. Hell, I was becoming one of them. It started with a few crates off the docks, Canadian whiskey, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. A friend of mine, we'll call him Benny, knew a foreman who owed him a favor. We moved the shipment in the middle of the night, no noise, no trouble. Sold it to a speakeasy in Midtown, and before the sun was up, I'd made more than my old man did in a month. That was the first taste. After that, I wanted the whole bottle. See, the thing about Prohibition was it didn't just create criminals. It created kings. And kings need armies. Mine started with a few guys from the neighborhood, the kind of fellas who knew how to keep quiet and work fast. But as the shipments got bigger, the circle got wider. That's how Meyer Lansky came into the picture. Smart guy. Too smart to get his hands dirty if he didn't have to, but he could move money like it was water. Then there was Frank Costello, smooth talker, could charm a cop and a judge in the same afternoon. We weren't just partners, we were building something. Of course, the cops didn't like it. Neither did the feds. But here's the thing, everybody's got a price. Some take cash. Some take favors. Some take the kind of quiet threats you don't put in writing. We paid them all, one way or another. That's how I learned the art of the envelope. You hand a man a thick one, look him in the eye, and you're not just buying his silence. You're buying his loyalty, his future decisions, maybe even his soul. Still, bribes only go so far. Every now and then they'd pick me up just to show they were doing their job. One time it was a raid on a warehouse. Another time they caught me riding shotgun in a truck full of gin. They'd haul me in, book me, maybe keep me overnight. The papers would get a nice headline, Luciano nabbed in liquor crackdown, and the next day I'd be back on the street. Charges dismissed. Insufficient evidence. It became a routine. Like a dance, and I was leading. One arrest, though, almost stuck. Winter of 23. Cold enough to freeze the river. I was meeting at Contact Uptown when the cops jumped us. They had a tip, they said a warehouse full of illegal stock. And they had my fingerprints on a crate. This wasn't some nickel-and-dime bust. They were talking months in the tombs, maybe a year upstate. My lawyer, a guy named Heller, sharp as a tack, told me we needed to play it careful. No bribes this time. Too many eyes on the case. So we played it legal. Heller tore their case apart, piece by piece. Questioned the chain of evidence, the reliability of the witness, the integrity of the cops involved. It turned out the tipster had a record longer than my arm, and the judge didn't like dirty cops any more than I did. The case collapsed like a bad roof in a rainstorm. When the gavel came down, I didn't smile, not in the courtroom anyway. You save the smiles for after. That close call taught me something important. Bribes are useful. Friends in high places are better. But the real secret is knowing when to keep your hands clean and let someone else do the dirty work. That way, even if the law comes knocking, they find nothing they can hang on you. The money kept rolling in. We weren't just running liquor anymore. We were running the city's nightlife. Every club, every backroom bar, every joint where the band played past midnight, we had a hand in it. And the more money we made, the harder it became for anyone to touch us. Politicians came to us for help. Cops came to us for jobs. Even reporters wanted a quote now and then. Imagine that, the same guys who called me a criminal asking for a good story. But with power comes attention. The feds started sending in men who didn't care about envelopes or handshakes. Men like Izzy Einstein and Mo Smith, famous Prohibition agents who could spot a speakeasy from a mile away. They'd bust into a joint, start pouring bottles down the drain, and slap the cuffs on anyone who didn't move fast enough. I respected guys like that, even if they were a pain in my neck. At least they played their side of the game straight. One night Meyer and I were sitting in a club on 52nd Street, watching the floor show. He leaned over and said, "Charlie, one day they're gonna make a law that makes this all legal again." I told him, "Yeah, and when that happens, we'll already own everything they need to make it work." He laughed, but I wasn't joking. I could see it, the long game. And that's what Prohibition taught me more than anything. Don't just think about tomorrow. Think about 10 years from now. Think about how the game changes and make sure you're the one changing it. Looking back, those early years were the best. The city was alive, dangerous, and full of opportunity. Every arrest, every close call, it was all part of the climb. And every time they tried to knock me down, I learned a new way to stand taller. That winter of 23, when the case almost stuck, it didn't scare me. It made me sharper. It made me realize that beating the law wasn't about luck, it was about control. Control the evidence, control the story, control the people telling it. That's how you win. And as long as I kept winning, the law would never really touch me. Not where it mattered. They called it a morals charge. Like they were the guardians of morality, like the same cops who shook down speakeasies for cash were saints on Sunday. It was the late 20s, and I'd gotten used to the cuffs by then. Usually, it was liquor, gambling, maybe some light racketeering. But this time, they wanted to drag my name through the dirt in a different way. The Vice Squad came after me hard. Not for money, not for booze, for women. I remember the night they picked me up. I was leaving a club on 46th Street, the kind where the champagne flowed like tap water and the girls wore smiles that cost more than your rent. Two detectives in overcoats stepped out of the shadows. No warning, no small talk, just hands on my arms and a shove into the back of an unmarked car. I didn't resist. I'd learned early that sometimes it's better to let them think they're in control, at least until you find the angle. At the station, they laid it out. They said I was running a prostitution ring. Not one or two girls, but dozens across half the city. They painted it like some scandal out of a cheap novel. I didn't say a word, not to them, not to the press. You let the papers talk, you let the rumors run wild, and when the truth comes out, you come out looking untouchable. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere: Luciano nabbed in vice raid, gang boss and moral scandal. The kind of ink you can't buy, the kind that makes you infamous. My lawyer told me it was bad for business. I told him it was business. People forget that in this game, reputation is as valuable as territory. Fear works, sure. But mystery? Mystery gets people talking. And when they're talking about you, they're not talking about the other guy. Still, I had to play it smart. I made sure the girls involved were taken care of: bail money, lawyers, safe places to disappear for a while. You protect the people who can bury you. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is knowing how to let the system destroy itself. The cops had rushed the case. Their witnesses were shaky, half of them couldn't keep their story straight, the other half were looking for a payday. My lawyer tore into them, polite but sharp, like peeling an apple with a razor. By the third day of hearings, it was falling apart. I sat there in court, calm as a man waiting for a train, watching the prosecution sweat. Every time they thought they had me, a witness would contradict themselves, or an airtight piece of evidence would turn out to be nothing more than gossip. The jury looked bored. The judge looked annoyed. And I just kept smiling, that little smile that said, "You can't touch me." When the charges were dismissed, the papers didn't print that on the front page. That's not how news works. The scandal sells, the acquittal gets buried somewhere in the middle. But I didn't care. The people who mattered, my partners, my rivals, the politicians I dealt with, they saw exactly what happened. The cops had tried to make me a spectacle, and all they'd done was make me bigger. Stronger. The funny thing is, I walked out of that courthouse with more respect than I had going in. Not because I beat the charge, guys beat charges all the time, but because I didn't flinch. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I let the storm hit me head on, and when it passed, I was still standing. In this life, that counts for everything. That morals charge was supposed to shame me. They thought they could make me small, make me untouchable in the wrong way. Instead, it reminded everyone that I didn't play by their rules. That I could take whatever they threw at me and turn it into an advantage. After that, every cop, every fed, every prosecutor who came after me had to ask themselves the same question: what if we can't make it stick? And that question? That's worth more than all the bribes in the world. By the early 30s, New York was a chessboard, and every piece was moving. But the players? They were the same stubborn old bosses still clinging to the old ways, like Sicily was just a boat ride away and America was some temporary stop. I respected tradition, sure. But tradition doesn't win wars. Strategy does. And I was done playing soldier. I wanted to run the whole damn board. The city was divided between the 5 families: Masuria, Maranzano, Mangano, Prophesy, and Gagliano. Each one a fortress with its own soldiers, rackets, and grudges. It wasn't business, it was tribal warfare. Guys would kill over insults, over turf the size of a street corner. I saw the blood it spilled, and I saw the money it cost. So I made a choice: either we kept bleeding, or we built something that would outlast all of us. That's when the commission was born. My idea, my blueprint. A table where the bosses could settle disputes without turning the streets into a war zone. Some people called it revolutionary. Others called it impossible. But I knew the truth: if you could get men who hated each other to make money together, you could control them. And if you could control them, you could control everything. Of course, pulling that off meant getting rid of the old guard. Joe the Boss Masuria was the first. He'd been my mentor once, taught me a lot about power and fear. But he was stubborn, short-sighted, still stuck in the idea that Sicilians should only deal with Sicilians. I'd seen the future, and it had names like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Jews, Irish, Italians, it didn't matter. Money didn't care what language you spoke. Masuria's end came on a spring afternoon in Coney Island. I left the table for the bathroom, and by the time I came back, he was slumped over his cards, a deck scattered on the floor. They said the shots echoed all the way to the boardwalk. I didn't pull the trigger, but I pulled the strings. And when the smoke cleared, the path was open. Salvatore Maranzano stepped in, and for a minute, I thought he'd be different. He wasn't. The man crowned himself boss of bosses, like we were back in Palermo 100 years ago. He even started talking about getting rid of me. That was a mistake. In September of '31, he met with his own end in his Park Avenue office. Some say it was me, some say it was my friends. All I'll say is this: a man who sees the future doesn't wait for the past to bury him. With Masuria and Maranzano gone, the city was mine to shape. The commission was established, a ruling council where the 5 families and our allies could divide the spoils without open war. No more boss of bosses. No more petty turf battles. We ran gambling, bootlegging, unions, construction. And the money? It flowed like wine at a wedding. You might think this made the law back off. It didn't. Every arrest from here on out was bigger, noisier, more political. They'd drag me in for questioning after a union rally, after a nightclub opening, even after charity events. Once, they arrested me at a baseball game in front of 1,000 people. But every time, I walked out. Lack of evidence. Unreliable witnesses. And sometimes, a little help from friends in high places. Those friends weren't just crooks. They were judges, city councilmen, even a few senators. Guys who understood that a city like New York doesn't run on laws, it runs on deals. And deals? Well, that's my specialty. You give a man a favor today, and you own him tomorrow. Still, there were moments when the pressure built. The feds were watching. The newspapers were sniffing around. My name was in the headlines so often I started thinking I should get a subscription just to keep track. But here's the thing, attention isn't always bad. The more they wrote about me, the more my legend grew. And in our world, legend is leverage. One time, after a big arrest, I think it was over a waterfront shakedown, a young detective leaned in while they were booking me and said, "One day we're gonna get you for good." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Kid, you could put me in a cell tomorrow, and I'd still be running this city before dinner." He didn't smile. But I did. Building the commission wasn't about ego. It was about survival. You keep the peace, you keep the money flowing, and you make sure the law can't point to one man as the head of the snake. The beauty of it was, while they were busy trying to figure out who was in charge, I was already 3 moves ahead. That's why, even with a dozen arrests under my belt, I stayed free. Not because I was lucky, though the name didn't hurt, but because I understood that power isn't about avoiding trouble. It's about controlling the terms when trouble comes. The families adapted. The old feuds died down. For a while, it almost felt like peace. But peace in this life is just a pause between storms. And I knew the next one was coming. I could feel it in the way the papers talked about me, in the way certain prosecutors' eyes followed me in court. They weren't going to stop. And neither was I. They said I ordered a hit. Not just any hit, a big one. The kind that makes headlines in papers from New York to Chicago. The kind that puts a bullseye on your back, not just from the cops but from the other side too. I remember the day they came for me. 2 detectives in plain clothes, not smiling, not talking. Just the kind of faces you see at a funeral, and maybe they thought that's where I was headed. They walked me out of my apartment like they'd already won. Outside, the flashbulbs went off so fast it felt like lightning. Reporters shouting questions, people craning their necks to see the mob boss in cuffs. I kept my chin up, my face calm. You don't give them the picture of you looking scared. You give them the picture they'll remember, the man who doesn't flinch. At the station, they laid it out. The victim was a union man, somebody who'd been making noise about corruption, threatening to spill names. According to their so-called witnesses, I'd given the order. Not in writing, not recorded, just whispered in some backroom over a glass of rye. That's how they do it when they don't have real evidence. They paint a picture and hope the jury fills in the blanks. They had 2 key witnesses. One was a small-time bookmaker who'd been picked up on a separate charge. The other was a guy who used to work for me until he started stealing. Both of them had something to gain from telling the story the cops wanted to hear. My lawyer, Heller, told me not to worry. "Charlie," he said, "if they had you, you'd already be in front of a grand jury. This is theater." He was right, but theater can still send you away if the audience claps loud enough. The arraignment was like a show. The prosecutor strutted in like he was auditioning for the lead in a courtroom drama. He talked about how the city couldn't be ruled by fear, about how no man was above the law. I sat there, hands folded, like I was listening to a bedtime story. Let him talk. The more he talks, the more chances he has to slip. When the trial started, the tension was thick enough to cut. The press filled every seat they could get. Cops lined the back wall like they were guarding the crown jewels. My witnesses were ready, my alibis were clean, but you never know how a jury's gonna see it. That's the thing about trials, they're not about truth, they're about performance. And I've always been good on stage. The bookmaker took the stand first. He told his story like he'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror. Said he overheard me giving the order, said I was laughing about it afterward. Heller leaned in on cross-examination and started pulling at the threads. "Isn't it true," he asked, "that you're facing your own charges right now?" The guy squirmed. "And isn't it true," Heller continued, "that your cooperation here might help reduce your sentence?" By the time he was done, the jury didn't see a witness, they saw a rat. The second witness was worse for the prosecution. The guy had a grudge so obvious you could smell it. He mixed up dates, got names wrong, and when Heller asked him if he'd been promised anything for his testimony, he hesitated just a little too long. That hesitation was all we needed. Each day, the case unraveled a little more. The prosecutor's voice got tighter, his questions sharper. I could feel him trying to dig his way out of the hole he'd made. But the jury wasn't buying it. They could see the game for what it was, an attempt to nail me without the nails. On the final day, Heller's closing argument was a masterpiece. He didn't just argue that I was innocent. He argued that the city needed to be careful about who it trusted. That rushing to judgment without proof was dangerous. He made it about more than me, he made it about them. And that's how you win a jury. You make them feel like they're protecting themselves, not you. The verdict came back faster than I expected. Not guilty. No celebration, no outburst, just a quiet exhale. I shook Heller's hand, stood up, and walked out like I had somewhere better to be. Outside, the reporters swarmed, shoving microphones and flashbulbs in my face. "Any comment, Charlie?" one of them shouted. I smiled just a little and said, "Next time, try harder." That murder rap could have ended me. Could have put me in a cell for 20 years, maybe more. Instead, it proved something I already knew: if you keep your story straight and your people close, they can't touch you. Not really. The law likes to think it's a hammer. But against the right kind of man, it's just a fly swatter. And me? I just swatted it away. Harlem had a rhythm all its own. You could hear it before you even hit 125th Street, the horns from the clubs, the shuffle of shoes on the sidewalks, the low murmur of deals being made in alleyways. It wasn't my neighborhood by birth, but I knew opportunity when I heard it. And Harlem? Harlem was singing money. The numbers racket ran hot there. Every corner had a runner, every runner had his pockets lined by someone higher up. It was like a living machine, a little cash here, a little fear there, and the wheels kept spinning. I didn't invent the numbers game, but I saw how big it could get. Problem was, so did the cops. I'd been making my visits to Harlem quiet-like. No parades, no headlines. A couple of my boys would meet the local guys in the back of a barbershop, sometimes in the upstairs room of a jazz club where the trumpets never stopped blowing. We'd talk collections, payouts, territory. Everybody knew that if you kept me happy, you kept the peace. But peace doesn't last in this business. Not when there's more money than the politicians can pretend not to see. Somebody got greedy, maybe a local runner who thought he could pocket a little extra without anyone noticing, maybe a cop who wanted to make a name for himself. Either way, one night in the summer of '34, the raids came. It started small, a dice game in the back of a record store busted up, a runner taken in for questioning. Then it spread. Doors kicked in, betting slips scooped up by the handful, men shoved into the backs of patrol cars. It was like they were trying to wash Harlem clean overnight, and I knew they were aiming for me. I wasn't in Harlem that night. I was downtown, having dinner with a politician who liked to pretend we were just business acquaintances. But by the time dessert hit the table, I had a message slipped into my hand. "It's happening," it said. Just 2 words, but I didn't need more. By midnight, I was in a car headed north, the city rolling past in flashes of street lamps and brick. I didn't go to the clubs or the bars. I went straight to a little bakery on Lenox Avenue that doubled as an office. The place was dark, the smell of bread still hanging in the air. Inside, my Harlem guy, Bumpy, was pacing like a caged tiger. "They're tearing us apart, Charlie," he said. "How many they got?" I asked. Too many, he said. And they're asking for you by name. That's when I knew this wasn't just about shutting down the numbers. This was about dragging me into a cell, making headlines, proving that no corner of New York was safe from their reach. But here's the thing, the cops had reach, sure. But I had roots. The next morning, the papers screamed about the raids. Photos of betting slips spread across desks, cops grinning like they'd found gold. They called it Operation Harlem Clean Sweep. I called it a temporary inconvenience. We moved fast. The beauty of the numbers racket was that it lived in the people's hands. You could shut down one spot and 3 more would pop up by the afternoon. We sent word to the runners to lay low for a couple of days, keep collections off the streets, use kids as go-betweens if they had to. By the time the cops figured out where the new action was, the trail would be cold. But the heat stayed on me. Detectives started shadowing my movements, parked cars waiting outside my usual haunts. Once, 2 of them tried to corner me outside a club, asking me to come in for a friendly chat. I smiled, told them I didn't speak English well enough for friendly chats, and walked away. They couldn't pin Harlem on me. Not directly. Every slip, every bet, every payout was hands away from mine. And the people? They weren't talking. In Harlem, the numbers game wasn't just crime, it was community. It paid rent, bought groceries, kept lights on. You don't sell out the man who keeps the machine running, especially not to the people who never cared if you went hungry. After a week, the raids slowed down. The cops had made their noise, filled their cells, taken their pictures. But the money kept moving. A little quieter, maybe, but still flowing the same direction. Toward me. One night, I went back to Harlem, sat in the corner of a club while the band played Slow and Sweet. Bumpy slid into the seat across from me, handed me an envelope. Thick, he said. Collections? I asked. He nodded. I tucked it away. We're still here, I told him. Always, he said. And he meant it. That's the thing the law never understood. You can raid the tables, you can take the slips, you can lock up a few runners. But you can't raid loyalty. And Harlem was loyal. So I lit a cigarette, leaned back, and let the music wash over me. The raids were already yesterday's news. Tomorrow? Tomorrow we'd be bigger. You don't last in this business without making enemies. Some of them you can see coming: rival crews, jealous lieutenants, guys who think they're smarter than they are. But the worst kind? The ones wearing the badge. Not just any badge. The badge with a name, a history, and a personal itch to see you in cuffs. For me, that itch belonged to Police Commissioner Valentine. Broad shoulders, sharp jaw, the kind of man the papers liked to call a crusader against vice. I called him what he was: a showman. He didn't care about cleaning the city, he cared about headlines. And what better headline than the man who finally put Charles Lucky Luciano behind bars? I'd been on his radar for years, but Harlem lit a fire under him. Those raids, they weren't just about numbers. They were about him making noise, showing the public that he could reach anywhere, even into my world. Trouble was, I'd slipped through his fingers again, and that made him look bad. And a man like Valentine? He couldn't stand looking bad. The first time I felt the shift was at a political fundraiser. I was there as a guest, technically. Paid for a table, wore the best suit money could buy, smiled at the right people. Valentine walked in like he owned the place. His eyes swept the room until they landed on me, and he didn't look away. Not once. Not even when someone grabbed his arm to talk. That kind of look? It's a promise. Within a week, I had plainclothes following me everywhere: restaurants, clubs, even when I was just walking down Broadway. They weren't subtle about it either, leaning on lampposts, pretending to read papers, but their eyes never moving. It was harassment, sure. But it was also bait. Valentine wanted me to slip, to give him something, anything he could run to the papers with. One afternoon, I was having coffee outside a cafe downtown. Across the street, a black sedan was parked, engine idling. 2 guys inside. I sent one of my boys to walk past just to check. He came back with a grin. "Cops," he said. They didn't even bother to hide the badge. I laughed. That was Valentine style, let you know he was there, breathing down your neck, trying to make you sweat. But I don't sweat easy. Instead, I tightened up the operation. No unnecessary meetings. No phone calls that weren't coded. No one carrying more than they could swallow if they had to. Every runner knew the drill. If you even thought you saw a tail, you disappear. Valentine wasn't satisfied with shadow games. He wanted a collar. So he started leaning on the people around me. Small club owners suddenly found themselves facing random inspections. My friends got pulled over for traffic violations that didn't exist. A girl I'd been seeing had her apartment searched for illegal liquor. They didn't find so much as a bottle cap. The message was clear: he couldn't get to me directly, so he'd make life hell for anyone standing close. And still, nothing stuck. Every case he tried to build fell apart before it even got to the courthouse. Witnesses forgot details. Evidence went missing. Paperwork got lost. That's the beauty of connections. The same people shaking your hand in daylight are the ones making sure certain files never see a judge's desk. But Valentine wasn't just a bulldog. He was patient. He started digging into my past, pulling every arrest report, every booking photo, every whisper from every informant who'd ever breathed my name. 25 arrests and counting, and I'd beaten almost all of them. To the public, it was proof that I was untouchable. To Valentine, it was proof that I needed to be broken. One night, I got a tip from a city clerk, a friend of a friend who owed me more than a few favors. Valentine was putting together something bigger than a numbers case. Bigger than liquor, bigger than gambling. He was talking about moral charges, the kind of case that could drag my name through the mud, even if it didn't stick in court. See, a man like me could survive a jail sentence. But public disgrace? That cut deeper. I didn't flinch. Not outwardly. Inwardly, I knew the game had changed. Valentine wasn't after my money or my rackets anymore. He was after my reputation. So I played it cool. Kept smiling, kept showing up in all the right places. I even tipped my hat to him once outside City Hall. He didn't tip back. But I saw his jaw tighten, and that told me I'd gotten under his skin. The more he pushed, the more careful I became. I knew his type. He'd wait for the one moment I let my guard down, and then he'd strike. And me? I was going to make him wait until his bones ached from it. Thing is, a vendetta like that doesn't burn out. It just builds. And as much as I hated to admit it, a part of me respected the man for his persistence. But respect doesn't mean mercy. And if Valentine thought he was the only one planning a checkmate, well, he was about to learn how I earned the name Lucky. The first whisper came from a coat check girl at the Park Central Hotel. She was one of mine, not in any official sense, but she'd been slipping me bits of overheard gossip for years. That night, her voice trembled when she told me Valentine had been meeting in private with a certain assistant district attorney. Not one of the usual political lapdogs. This one was different, young, ambitious, and worst of all, clean. No skeletons in the closet, no bad debts, no taste for the nightlife. That meant nothing to buy him with and nothing to scare him off. The kind of man who'd come at you with a smile and a file full of evidence. The kind who didn't mind burning a few bridges to make a name. The word on the street was that they weren't just building a case against my rackets. They were building a case against me. Not Lucky Luciano the businessman. Not Lucky Luciano the harmless gambler. But me, the man. They wanted something that would turn the public's stomach. They wanted moral outrage. And in that world, there was one charge that could make even the toughest allies take a step back: running a vice ring. Not liquor, not numbers, not cards. Women. It didn't matter that I'd never touched that racket directly. The truth didn't matter in these kinds of cases, only the story. And a story about a gangster running a network of brothels? That was the kind of thing that could turn a crusading DA into a hero and a commissioner into a legend. At first, I brushed it off. I'd been accused of worse. But then I started seeing faces I didn't recognize, women being hauled in on vague charges, questioned for hours, and then sent back out with nothing on paper. My people said Valentine's men were squeezing them for names. Not just my name, my friends, my associates, anyone who might be linked to me. One of them broke. Not because she was scared of me, but because she was terrified of the cops. They promised her protection, maybe even a new life out west. All she had to do was say she'd worked under my orders. And she did. Just like that, the first brick in their wall was set. It was a clever move. They didn't need all the women to talk. Just a few. Enough to make the rest start wondering if maybe they should get ahead of the wave before it crashed. Fear spreads faster than loyalty. I doubled down on security. Every meeting was moved. Every phone call was rerouted. I even stopped showing my face at some of my own clubs. But it didn't matter. Valentine wasn't chasing me in the open anymore, he was digging under my feet. And the DA? He was putting it together like a puzzle. One piece at a time, until the picture was clear enough to take to court. The real blow came when they flipped one of my lieutenants. Not a big name, not someone the papers would recognize, but he'd been around long enough to know the layout of the business. They picked him up on a trumped-up charge, locked him in a cell, and let him stew. Then they dangled the deal: immunity, a clean record, maybe even some cash on the side. All he had to do was testify that I ran everything from the top. He took it. I don't even think he hesitated. That's the thing about betrayal, you never see it coming from the ones you think are small time. The big guys know they've got too much to lose. But the little guys? They're the cracks in the wall. And once there's a crack, the whole thing can fall apart. By the time I got the full picture, it was almost too late. Valentine and the DA had a list: names, dates, locations. The kind of detail that sounds ironclad when a jury hears it, even if half of it's smoke. They had women ready to point at me across a courtroom. They had cops who'd swear under oath they'd seen me at certain addresses. They even had bank ledgers, doctored, of course, that made it look like money from those places was funneled straight into my pockets. I knew the game well enough to understand that this wasn't just about the law. This was about spectacle. They wanted a raid, a headline, a trial that dripped with scandal. They wanted me to be the face of vice in New York City. And if they couldn't beat me in the streets, they'd beat me in the papers. I had two choices: go underground and ride it out, or stand and fight. Disappearing wasn't my style. It would have looked like guilt. And besides, I'd worked too damn hard to build this empire to let them tear it down without a fight. So I started lining up my own pieces. Lawyers, the best money could buy. Private eyes to dig into the DA's life. Valentine's too. Not for blackmail, not yet, but to know what kind of men I was dealing with. Everyone's got a pressure point. The night before the first raid, I sat in my apartment looking out over the city lights. I knew it was coming, my sources were too good to miss something like that. But knowing didn't make it any easier. There's a particular kind of silence the night before a storm. The air feels heavy. Every sound outside makes you wonder if it's the knock at your door. I poured myself a drink, lit a cigarette, and smiled. Not because I wasn't worried. I was. But worry never won a fight. And tomorrow, when Valentine made his big move, I'd be ready. It happened just after sunrise, the hour when the city is half awake, when the streets still smell like last night's rain, and the air is too quiet for comfort. I was at my apartment, still in a silk robe, the cigarette in my hand burning slow. The sound came first, that deep, rolling growl of engines, too many at once to be a coincidence. Then the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, climbing up from the lobby. No shouting, no banging, not yet. They wanted the element of surprise, wanted to catch me in that groggy moment between dream and reality. But I wasn't groggy. I was waiting. My eyes flicked to the hallway mirror, my hair was perfect, the robe tied neat. If they were going to drag me out, they weren't going to get the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. The knock finally came. 3 hard raps that shook the frame. "Open up, Luciano. We've got a warrant." Valentine's voice. "Calm. Too calm." I took my time crossing the room, not because I wanted to make a point, but because I wanted them to hear my footsteps, slow, steady, unbothered. I unlocked the door and swung it open like I was welcoming an old friend. Valentine stood there with a dozen men behind him, half in uniforms, half in plainclothes. The kind of plainclothes that still screamed cop from a mile away. His eyes swept over me, searching for a crack, but he found nothing. "We're taking you in," he said. "On charges of compulsory prostitution, racketeering, and conspiracy." He read it like a grocery list. I didn't flinch. "Hope you brought enough paper for all that," I told him. A couple of his men smirked, but Valentine's jaw tightened. He stepped aside, and 2 uniforms moved in, hands already on me. I let them. No struggle, no scene. That was part of my code, never give them the pleasure. Out in the hallway, the flashbulbs hit me like sunlight. They'd brought the press, of course they had. The corridor was lined with photographers, reporters shouting questions. "Lucky, is it true you run every brothel in the city?" "Lucky, how many girls work for you?" "Lucky, do you have anything to say to your public?" I gave them what they wanted, a smile. Not a big one, just the kind that says, "You don't have me yet." Cameras clicked like gunfire. Downstairs, the sidewalk was a circus. Squad cars lined the curb, their sirens silent but their lights spinning red. People had gathered, morning commuters, shopkeepers, kids with wide eyes. They wanted a show, and I was the main act. Valentine pushed me toward the car, and I slid in without breaking stride. The ride to the precinct was quiet. Valentine sat across from me, his eyes fixed like he was trying to memorize my face for the history books. "You're going away for a long time," he said finally. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe this is just another headline for you to clip out and frame on your wall." His mouth twitched, but he didn't answer. At the station, the booking process was just another performance. Fingerprints, mugshots, I'd done it before. They kept me in the holding cell for hours, letting the reporters swarm outside the bars, calling out questions while the flashbulbs popped. It was all part of Valentine's plan. He didn't just want me arrested. He wanted me branded. He wanted the public to see me not as the man who'd built an empire, but as a parasite who fed on the city's shame. By noon, the newspapers had already hit the stands. I could see the headlines from the cell: "Lucky Luciano arrested in vice crackdown, king of the underworld charged with running citywide brothel ring." The pictures were worse, me in cuffs, the smirk still on my face, flanked by 2 stone-faced detectives. It was exactly the image they wanted burned into people's minds. When they finally brought me into the interrogation room, the DA was waiting. Young, sharp suit, the smell of ambition stronger than his cologne. He didn't waste time. "We've got witnesses, Mr. Luciano. We've got ledgers, phone records, sworn statements. You can fight this, but it's going to be a long, ugly fight. You could save yourself a lot of trouble by cooperating." I leaned back in the chair, studying him like he was a card I wasn't sure was worth playing. "I don't run girls," I said flatly. "Never have. If you've got someone saying otherwise, they're lying. Probably because you paid them to." His lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "The jury will believe them." "That's the thing about juries," I said. "They can believe whatever story you tell well enough." "But me? I write better stories." That got under his skin. I could see it in the way he tapped his pen faster now, like he was keeping time with his own irritation. After that, they tossed me into a cell for the night. Concrete walls, iron bars, the distant smell of bleach and old sweat. Outside, the city moved on without me. Inside, I lay back on the cot and listened to the quiet. I knew this was just the opening move. Valentine had played it well, the raid, the cameras, the charges that made even my friends look at me sideways. But the game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I'd been in tighter spots. And if there's one thing I understood better than anyone, it's that a trial isn't fought in the courtroom alone. It's fought in the streets, in the papers, in the whispers that pass from one corner to another. They wanted me to be the villain of their story. I was going to make sure I stayed the author of mine. The morning after the arrest, I was up before the guards. Sleep had been thin, just a few shallow hours between the echo of boots in the hallway. My lawyer, Heller, showed up at first light, the kind of man who wore a three-piece suit like armor and never smiled unless he was billing you for it. He slid into the chair across from me, dropped his briefcase on the table, and said, "They're building the case of the century, Lucky. And they're building it on you." I lit a cigarette, ignoring the stale air. "They've tried that before. This time's different," he said. "They've got over 200 witnesses lined up. Former girls, pimps, even guys from your own crew who think they can shave time off their own charges by throwing you under the bus." I exhaled slow. 200 liars doesn't make one truth. He didn't laugh. The DA's not playing for truth. He's playing for theater. And right now, he's got the whole city buying tickets. He laid out the files, statements, photographs, lists of names. Some I recognized, some I didn't. But the pattern was clear. They weren't trying to nail me on one act, they were painting me as the architect of the whole damn vice economy. Brothels, gambling dens, the works. They wanted the jury to believe every vice in New York had my fingerprints on it. "What's our play?" I asked. Heller leaned in, lowering his voice even though the room was empty. "First, we stall. Delay the trial. Time dulls outrage. People forget headlines faster than they think. Second, we discredit their witnesses. Every single one. If they've ever lied, stolen, or breathed wrong in public, the jury's going to hear about it." I nodded. "And the third?" He gave me a thin smile. "We remind them who you are. Not some back alley thug. A businessman. A man who keeps order in places the city can't. We sell them the image they're already half willing to believe." While Heller worked the legal angles, my people worked the streets. Every bartender, cabbie, and street corner newsboy got the same instruction: keep my name alive, but keep it clean. Stories about generosity, about favors I'd done, about times I'd stepped in where the cops didn't. I wasn't just fighting the DA, I was fighting the version of me they'd built in the papers. Meanwhile, Valentine wasn't letting up. He made sure every day brought a new leak, some fresh evidence for the press to lap up. One morning it was a ledger with coded names and numbers they swore tied back to me. The next, it was a statement from a madam who claimed I'd personally given her orders. Each story hit like a drumbeat, meant to keep the public wound tight until trial day. Inside the jail, I kept my posture the same as it had been on the street, unshaken. If the guards or the other inmates saw fear, it would spread like smoke. So I moved slow, spoke less, and watched everything. You learn a lot in a place like that: who talks to who, which guards pass notes, which prisoners get extra phone calls. Heller visited every other day, each time with another stack of papers. Witness lists grew. So did the pressure. "They're offering deals to half the girls who ever worked under one of your guys," he said. "Immunity, relocation, whatever it takes to get them on the stand." "They'll say whatever gets them out of here," I said. "That's the problem," Heller replied. "The jury will believe them. At least at first." We had to start chipping away early. My men outside dug up dirt, unpaid debts, criminal records, false statements from years past. Some of these witnesses had more skeletons than the crypt at St. Patrick's. The trick was making the jury see that before they swallowed the DA's story whole. By the second week, the trial date was set. No more delays. The city buzzed like it was gearing up for a prize fight. Reporters camped outside the courthouse steps. Editorials called me everything from the most dangerous man in America to the last great gangster of a dying era. They didn't know whether to hate me or romanticize me, and that was exactly where I wanted them. The night before the trial began, I sat in my cell, the air thick with the scent of iron and dust. I thought about the faces I'd see in the courtroom. The jurors, 12 ordinary people about to be dropped into the middle of a war they didn't understand. The witnesses, some honest, some bought, some just chasing their moment under the lights. And Valentine, sitting in the front row like a man who thought he'd already won. I pictured the courtroom. The polished wood, the click of typewriter keys, the shuffle of papers. I could see myself walking in, head high, suit pressed sharp enough to cut glass. I knew every camera in the room would be watching for a crack, for a twitch, for anything that hinted at weakness. They'd be waiting for me to play the part they'd written. But I wasn't there to play their part. When the guards finally locked down for the night, I lay back on the cot and closed my eyes. I thought about the game ahead, not in days or weeks, but in moves. Every answer, every glance, every pause in my voice would be a move. This wasn't just about proving innocence or guilt. It was about control. By morning, the first day of the trial, the whole city would be watching. And if there's one thing I'd learned in this life, it's that you don't win a crowd by showing them the truth. You win by showing them the story they didn't know they wanted. And I was about to give them one they'd never forget. The morning of the trial, the air outside the courthouse was already electric. The sidewalks were lined with people craning their necks for a glimpse, some with eyes full of hate, others with that strange kind of admiration reserved for men the papers call infamous. Photographers jostled for position, their flashbulbs popping like distant gunfire. I stepped out of the prison van in a gray pinstripe suit, a fresh shave, and a fedora tilted just enough to shadow my eyes. Not a smile, not a frown, just the steady, unshaken look of a man walking into his own living room. Inside, the courtroom smelled of varnished wood and tension. Every bench was packed. The reporters were already scribbling, some staring at me instead of their notes, as if they could catch a headline just by watching how I moved. Valentine sat at the prosecutor's table, his suit immaculate, his eyes fixed on me with that thin-lipped smirk that made you want to break something. I met his stare for a fraction longer than was polite, then looked away like he wasn't worth the space in my mind. Jury selection began, slow, deliberate. The DA's team leaned on questions about morality, about whether the potential jurors could set aside what they'd heard in the papers. They were fishing for clean slates, people who'd take every word from the witness stand as gospel. My lawyer, Heller, had other plans. He asked about business experience, about skepticism, about whether they believed every story the press told. It wasn't just about finding sympathetic ears, it was about planting seeds. Even those who didn't make the jury would carry those questions back into the crowd outside. One woman in her 40s couldn't stop glancing at me as she spoke. The DA pressed her hard, maybe thinking she was too curious for his liking. She didn't make the cut, but her expression stayed in my head, not admiration, not fear, but interest. People like that were dangerous to the prosecution because interest turns into doubt faster than fear ever could. By the time the 12 jurors were sworn in, I'd already memorized their faces, their postures, the way their eyes moved when they listened. There was a man in the back row, mid-50s, calloused hands, the kind of guy who'd seen the rough side of a paycheck. There was a young woman near the front who tilted her head when she was skeptical, and she'd done it twice during Valentine's questions. And then there was the old man in the corner, half-deaf maybe, but watching everything like a hawk. When Valentine stood for his opening statement, he went straight for the throat. He painted me as the shadow behind every vice in the city, the man who'd profited from the ruin of lives, the architect of an empire built on exploitation. His voice rose and fell like a preacher's, each word landing heavy. He didn't just accuse, he condemned, like the verdict was already written and the trial was just ceremony. I watched the jurors, not him. Some leaned in, caught up in the drama. Others stayed still, their eyes darting toward me now and then. I kept my posture easy, one hand resting lightly on the table, no fidgeting, no sign of tension. Let Valentine burn through his fire early. Trials aren't won in the first act. When Heller rose for our opening, the energy shifted. He didn't defend me outright, not yet. He dismantled the prosecution's foundation piece by piece. You will hear from many witnesses, he told the jury. Some will tell you stories that sound convincing. But you must ask yourselves, what do they stand to gain? Freedom? Money? Revenge? Because the truth is not what is handed to you in a neat package by the state. The truth is buried, and together we are going to dig it out. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He let silence do half the work. Every pause made the jurors lean in a little more. And when he finished, he didn't look at Valentine. He looked at me, nodded once, and sat down. The first witness was called before lunch, a woman in her 30s, dressed to look respectable but wearing the kind of jewelry you don't buy without fast money. She said she'd worked in one of the houses under my protection, claimed she'd seen me there giving orders, setting prices. Her voice trembled at the right moments, and the DA let the room soak in her every word. Heller's cross-examination was quick and sharp. You said you've been out of that life for years. And yet you've been arrested twice since then, isn't that correct? She hesitated, glanced at Valentine, then admitted it. And each time, the charges were dropped, correct? Another pause. Another yes. By the time Heller was done, the jury was looking at her differently. Not as a victim. As a player. When the judge called recess, the buzz in the courtroom was different. Valentine had landed his first punch, but it hadn't hit clean. Outside, the press swarmed, shouting questions. I didn't answer a single one. I just walked past, coat buttoned, fedora low, the picture of control. Inside, in the quiet of the defense room, Heller looked at me and said, "That was just the warm-up. The real fight starts tomorrow." I leaned back in the chair, lit a cigarette, and said, "Then tomorrow we don't just defend. We go on the attack." Day 2 of the trial began with a sky the color of wet cement, the kind that makes the city feel like it's holding its breath. The courthouse steps were slick from an early rain, and the crowd outside was twice as big as yesterday. Some of them had newspapers rolled under their arms, my face stamped on the front page like I was some kind of movie poster. The flashbulbs were already snapping before I even reached the door, voices calling my name from both sides, but I didn't so much as glance in their direction. I kept walking, the echo of my shoes on stone louder than the shouting. Inside, the air was thick with expectation. Valentine was already at his table, flipping through his notes like a man rehearsing his lines. His expression was smug, the kind of look that says he's about to pull a rabbit out of his hat. Heller walked in a step behind me, no small talk, no smile, just a curt nod that meant he was ready to draw blood. The judge entered, the gavel cracked, and the second day was underway. Valentine didn't waste time. He called his star witness Anthony Little Tony Caruso, a man I'd known since he was barely old enough to shave. We'd done business together, the kind of business where trust was worth more than contracts. But now here he was, walking in with that hangdog expression, pretending like it pained him to testify. His suit was too sharp for a man who claimed he was broke, and I noticed the faint bulge of a watch under his cuff, the kind the feds like to gift to their friends. Valentine painted him as the reluctant truth-teller, the insider who'd finally decided to come clean. Little Tony spoke slow, like each word was costing him something. He said I'd been at meetings where deals were struck, that I'd personally ordered certain collections to be made. He avoided specifics when the dates didn't line up, but Valentine steered him back on course, feeding him the rhythm. It was theater, pure and simple, and some of the jury was buying it. Then it was Heller's turn. He didn't rush the walk to the podium. He just stood there for a beat, letting the silence stretch until you could hear the shifting of shoes in the gallery. "Mr. Caruso," he began, "how long have you been in government protection?" Tony tried to play it modest. "A few months." Heller nodded. "And in that time, they've been paying for your rent?" A pause. "Yes." "Your food?" Another pause. "Yes." "Your clothing?" Tony's eyes flicked toward Valentine. "Yes." "And that watch you're wearing, did you buy that yourself?" Tony hesitated. "It was a gift." Heller leaned forward just slightly. "From whom?" Tony muttered, "From the bureau." The jury was shifting now, their pens slowing. Heller pressed on. "In exchange for this generosity, you've agreed to testify here today, correct?" "I'm here to tell the truth," Tony said, but his voice was thinner now, the rehearsed tone cracking. "Of course," Heller said smoothly. "And yet, in your original statement to police, you never once mentioned my client's presence at these alleged meetings. That only came up after you entered protection. Why is that?" Tony opened his mouth, closed it again. The silence stretched, and you could feel the tension snap like a wire in the room. Heller didn't need to push much further. By the time he thanked the witness and walked back to the table, the damage was done. Valentine's prize exhibit was starting to look like a bought and paid for prop. The rest of the morning was a carousel of witnesses, minor players, each one trying to cash in their testimony for lighter sentences or dropped charges. Heller dismantled them methodically, never raising his voice, never rushing. He'd let them talk themselves into corners, then closed the door gently behind them. The jurors began to listen differently now, their pens moving less, their eyes flicking between the witnesses and me. By recess, the air in the courtroom had shifted. It was subtle, but I could feel it, that first little crack in the prosecution's wall. Valentine still carried himself like the tide was in his favor, but I'd seen enough fights to know when a man's footing had gone soft. In the defense room, Heller poured himself a coffee, sat down, and said, "We keep peeling layers. By the time this is over, they'll be holding an empty shell." I lit a cigarette, leaned back, and exhaled slow. "Good," I said. "Because an empty shell doesn't scare anybody." Tomorrow, the real storm was coming, our turn to put someone on the stand who could burn Valentine's whole case to the ground. And I was going to make sure the jury didn't just hear it. They were going to feel it. They called it day 3, but to me, it was the day the ground under Valentine's shoes was going to start shaking. The morning light poured through the courthouse windows like it was trying to wash the place clean, but you can't scrub away years of dirt with sunshine. The crowd outside was restless, pushing against the barricades, the low hum of voices swelling every time a door opened. Inside, the benches were packed tight, the smell of coffee and damp coats mixing into something stale. I walked in slow, same as always, my steps measured, my face unreadable. I wasn't there to play to the press. I was there for the 12 people in that box. The jury was the only audience that mattered. And today, we had a show for them. Heller didn't waste time with small moves. As soon as the formalities were done, he stood, buttoned his jacket, and said, "The defense calls Detective Michael Quinn to the stand." The room shifted. A cop called by the defense? That wasn't something anyone saw coming. Quinn walked in wearing his badge on his belt, not on his chest, a quiet statement that he was off duty, off the clock, and maybe off the leash. He had that kind of tired face you only get from seeing too much of the city's underbelly. Heller approached slow. "Detective Quinn, you've been with the Organized Crime Division for how many years?" 18, Quinn said, voice steady. "And in that time, you've investigated my client?" "Yes." "Ever arrested him?" "No." "Why not?" Quinn didn't blink. "Because I never saw proof he committed the crimes he was accused of." "Rumors, yes. Whispers, sure. But proof? Never." The words landed like a brick on the prosecution's table. Valentine shifted in his seat, his pen tapping against his pad. Heller kept going. "Detective, are you familiar with the FBI's current investigation against my client?" "I am." "And do you believe it's based on credible, untainted evidence?" Quinn hesitated just long enough for the tension to rise and then said, "No. I believe it's been compromised." Now the air was electric. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, like he wanted to hear more. Heller's tone didn't change, but his eyes were locked on Quinn. "Compromised how?" Quinn glanced at the jury, then back to Heller. "Witnesses being paid off. Evidence disappearing from chain of custody. Statements changed after they entered federal protection. I've seen it happen. I've filed reports on it. And every time I did, those reports went missing." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the sound couldn't erase what had just been said. Heller stepped closer, voice lower now, like he was letting the jury in on a secret. "Detective, in your professional opinion, is this case against my client built on solid ground?" "No," Quinn said. "It's built on sand." The silence that followed was heavy. You could feel it in your bones. Valentine's cross-examination was short. He tried to paint Quinn as a disgruntled officer, someone with a grudge. But Quinn didn't flinch. Every answer was clean, calm, and grounded in fact. He wasn't there to save me, he was there to tell the truth as he saw it. And that made him dangerous. When he stepped down, I caught Valentine watching him leave with a look I knew too well, the look of a man realizing the war he thought he was winning was about to turn. Back in the defense room, Heller was almost smiling. "That," he said, "was the first domino." I poured myself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and said, "Let's make sure the rest of them fall." Tomorrow wasn't just another day in court. Tomorrow was when we'd start naming names, and some of those names wore very expensive suits. The courtroom was different that morning. It wasn't just a place for arguments anymore, it felt like an arena. Everyone knew what was coming, even if they didn't know the names yet. The benches were packed tighter than ever, reporters elbowing each other for space, their notebooks ready, pencils sharpened like knives. Outside, the street was clogged with people straining for a glimpse, their breath frosting in the cold as they whispered rumors. When I walked in, there was no applause, no booing, just a wave of quiet that followed me to my seat. That kind of silence has weight. It means they're not sure whether to admire you or be afraid of you. I've always liked that space in between. Heller started slow, the way a man eases into cold water. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense would like to submit into evidence a series of financial records obtained through lawful subpoena." Valentine objected immediately, his voice sharp. "Irrelevant and prejudicial." "Overruled," the judge said, almost before the words were out of his mouth. That was the first cut. Heller lifted a folder and spread the papers out on the table like he was laying down cards in a high-stakes poker game. "These records," he said, turning to the jury, "show cash transfers, unreported income, and offshore accounts tied directly to individuals involved in the investigation against my client. Not criminals. Not gangsters. Federal agents. Prosecutors. City officials. The room shifted. People sat straighter. Pens scratched faster. "Let's start," Heller said, with Assistant District Attorney Charles Morrissey. The name hit the gallery like a slap. Morrissey had a reputation, the golden boy of the DA's office, all clean suits and cleaner headlines. Heller held up a bank statement. $45,000, deposited into an account in the Cayman Islands. Date? 2 weeks after the first witness against my client was placed under federal protection. Morrissey wasn't in the room, but you could feel his ghost there, pacing in the corner. Valentine didn't move. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on his notes, but I knew he was listening to every syllable. "And here," Heller continued, pulling another sheet, "we have a payment of $18,000, funneled through a construction company owned by Detective John Ferraro. Same Ferraro who filed the chain of custody logs for Exhibit C, the missing ledger." The judge's gavel cracked once, twice. Order in the court. But there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. The jury's faces were shifting, some looked confused, others angry. A few had the kind of expression you see when someone realizes they've been played. Heller paced slowly, never raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not about whether you like my client. This is about whether the people who swore to uphold the law have kept their oath. Because if they haven't, then every word they've said to you is poisoned." Valentine's cross was shorter than it had ever been. He didn't try to argue the money was fake, he knew the paper didn't lie. All he could do was suggest it was misinterpreted, that maybe there were legitimate explanations. But the problem with legitimate explanations is they sound thin when you're already bleeding. When the session ended, I didn't stand right away. I just sat there, letting the crowd file out, letting them think about what they'd just heard. Back in the defense room, Heller shut the door and leaned against it. "Tomorrow," he said, "we bring out the witnesses. And when they start talking, it's not just going to shake the case, it's going to bring the whole house down." I nodded once, slow. "Then tomorrow," I said, "we stop playing defense.